My name is Pat Plonsky. I am the Director of Books for Africa and also a proud member of the MINN Board of Directors. MINN, of course, stands for the Minnesota International NGO Network. So for those of you who weren't here earlier, this is our annual summit. It's our key event of the year, and MINN is the a compilation of all of the international NGOs working here in Minnesota. And if you're not a member, we invite you to become a member and be more involved with MINN. It's my honor today to introduce to you our keynote speaker for the MINN Summit, Carol Spahn, Director of the Peace Corps. In the way of background, the Peace Corps was initially established by President John F. Kennedy by executive order on March 1, 1961, and formally authorized by Congress on September 22nd, 1961, with passage of the Peace Corps Act. It should be noted that U.S. Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota first proposed the idea of a Peace Corps in 1957 and continued to champion it when it was established in 1961. It is truly fitting that we hear from Director Spahn here today in this room, named in honor of Senator Hubert H. Humphrey. The President of the United States appoints the Peace Corps Director, and the appointments must be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Funding for the Peace Corps is included in the State Foreign Affairs and Related Programs Appropriations Bill, and generally the Peace Corps budget is about 1% of the Foreign Affairs budget. Carol Spahn was appointed into office as the 21st Director of the Peace Corps on December 21, 2022. Director Spahn brings more than 25 years of public and private sector experience and has worked in countries around the world on issues ranging from small business development and infectious disease prevention to women's empowerment. She most recently served as the Peace Corps' Chief Executive Officer, and prior to that, as Acting Director. Previously, Director Spahn also was the Peace Corps' Chief of Operations in the Africa region and the Country Director of Peace Corps Malawi. Director Spahn's Peace Corps roots extend back to when she was a volunteer from 1994 to 1996 in Romania, where she served as a special business advisor. Before returning to the Peace Corps as Country Director, Director Spahn was Senior Vice President of Operations at Women for Women International, an organization serving marginalized and socially excluded women in conflict-afflicted countries. Prior to that, Director Spahn served as Executive Director of Accordia Global Health Foundation, a nonprofit focused on creating sustainable centers of excellence in health in Africa. She's also served as Vice President, Chief Financial Officer, and Treasurer of Small Enterprise Assistance Funds, a nonprofit private equity fund manager that invests in small and medium-sized companies in developing countries. So Director Spahn is well-versed in the work of international nonprofits and NGOs. Director Spahn holds a bachelor's degree from the Catholic University of America and a master's degree in international development from the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Carol Spahn.
All right, Minnesota, it is great to be here. I see the back of the room is really full, and there aren't that many people up front, which is making me feel like I'm talking to people really far away. I invite you, if you feel so comfortable, to come join us up front. It would make me feel great if you could join us. There we go. Don't leave me hanging. Don't leave me hanging. Thank you so much. It is really such an honor to be with you all today here in Minnesota, the North Star State. That is appropriately named, sort of given what we are here to do and given our work. And it's great to see that there are so many people who care here in Minnesota and care enough to show up and work on creating a better world. And I have to say, I love the theme for this summit, which is doing global good better. That will always be a North Star. That is something I've learned in every single organization, that we have to rethink, recalibrate, challenge ourselves, bring the lessons from academia, from government, from small enterprise, from centers of excellence, working at grassroots, working with leadership. In each and every role I have had, we have had to dig deep and been challenged to do global good better. And when I think about this moment that we are in right now following the COVID-19 pandemic, as a globe, we have never experienced something like COVID-19, where communities, families, countries were closed off from each other, were isolated for long periods of time. And that has a tremendous impact, not only on sort of development gains and losses. We lost a lot during the pandemic, but it wasn't just those material gains. It wasn't just educational losses. It wasn't just the loss of life and health. It was that loss of connectedness, that drives us as humans. And I think as we go back out into the world, we have to really think about not just the work itself, but how we are showing up, how we show up with humility, how we show up with compassion and partnership and localization, right? How are we really working to change the structures that drive the power imbalances in the work that we do, not only here in the United States, but around the world? But even more than that, it's choosing to show up at all. It is far too easy in today's world to hide behind a screen, to hide behind the anonymity of social media, to criticize, and to not be in the arena. We have to get more people engaged, who are in the arena, who are willing to take action, who are willing to be a part of the change that we want to see, and not just staying behind the screen to criticize. To challenge us all, yes. Challenging is good. We should all be challenged. We should all listen to the voices that are challenging us to do better. But let's come with solutions. Let's come with action. Let's try new things. The field of international development is so rich and so complex and so engaging because of all of the things that make it about connection and that challenge us across cultures to understand each other better. And this is an important moment to be rethinking all of that. A couple of days ago, I spoke to a friend and he shared a quote. It says, "Hope isn't an adjective, but a verb. Hope is what you do. Hope is action. It is about stepping outside of your comfort zone to try to make a difference. Hope is a Peace Corps volunteer leaving everything they know behind to live and work and immerse themselves in another community, in another country for 2 years. 2 years to show that not only does America care, but Americans care. Americans care. Hope is each and every one of you today working with communities and governments and partners and bringing your unique gifts, your unique niche, your unique understanding to lift up voices that need to be heard, to challenge the status quo, whether that is training 3,000 local healthcare providers to deliver pediatric cardiac care the way Children's Heart Link has, or working with communities in rural Sierra Leone to identify, develop, and carry out their own sustainable solutions to the challenges they face, like One Village Partners does. or recognizing just how vital not only is literacy to a children's future, but access to books. And then sharing more than 57 million books with children around the world in every single African country over the past 30 years, the way that Books for Africa has. These are just a few ways that the people of Minnesota, the organizations that are represented here, have really stood up to make a difference. And international development requires hope. It requires the sense of optimism that we can create a brighter future together, that our actions matter, and that the relationships we build along the way are really the foundation of world peace and friendship, which is Peace Corps' mission. And what better place to talk about hope than here at the Hubert Humphrey School of Public Affairs. This school really does stand as a testament to the legacy of a phenomenal public servant, Hubert Humphreys. And I didn't know this, but he was apparently known as the Happy Warrior. I was trying to think of how I would want to be known, and that's a pretty amazing thing to be known as, right? To be someone who can fight for what's right and do so with a smile on your face and engage people along the way. He never shied away from that opportunity to step up and lead when it was needed. So he left behind just this tremendous legacy, both the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a nuclear test ban treaty at the height of the Cold War, United States Senator and Vice President, and of course, father of the Peace Corps. Now, most people say that President Kennedy was the founder of the Peace Corps. We can have founders, we can have fathers, we can have godfathers. Nothing happens by one person acting alone. And Hubert Humphrey was the author of the first Peace Corps bill. He was the man who led passage of the Peace Corps Act through Congress in 1961. Without him and his energy and his drive to get that through and get it through quickly at a time that really, for me, harkens back to this moment we're living in today, when there is significant disruption, where the global order is shifting, where the need to engage and to show up again across borders as Americans and be with people and show them who we are and what we're made of is so incredibly important. President Biden has called this moment in history an inflection point. It's an inflection point because so many of those things are shifting. And when I think about Hubert Humphrey, and I think about us sitting around here right now, think about what we've been through over the last couple of years, I flash forward 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now and wonder, what will we say about this time? How will we say we stepped up to help define how we will move forward differently as a global community, knowing what we know now, knowing what we've been through? What will that legacy be? What about a bold legacy in this moment of creativity, of ingenuity, of adaptability, of embracing and lifting up great local leaders? Because really that is what we need around the world right now. And this moment is demanding that we step up boldly. And I'm not talking about incremental change. Some of you who have worked with me know that I really don't like the phrase lean in. Let's lean into this. When you lean in from a place of safety. You lean a little bit in, right? It's a risk, but it's not too much of a risk, right? You're putting yourself out there, but you can still lean back, right? And I feel like this moment requires the kind of really bold creativity and thinking. It needs us to jump in with both feet. and really, really dig deep on our own organizational values and the systems and structures that define how we show up in the world. As many of you may know, Peace Corps in March of 2020, which will just always, I think, be a moment in time for all of us, evacuated globally for the first time in our organization's history. We evacuated almost 7,000 volunteers from 64 countries around the world. Some of those volunteers were 3 days away from the capital. We did it in 8 days, with borders closing, with flights being canceled. It was utter chaos and beauty at the same time to watch the whole network come together to do this. And then we had to say, all right, what now? What do we do now? How do we show up now? And what will the world require of us when we go back? So during the pandemic, we asked each and every one of our staff around the world to engage in whatever way they could to advance the Peace Corps mission, to support COVID efforts in whatever way they could, and they did. Whether it was supporting online learning and teacher training in Macedonia, to supporting mass vaccination campaigns in Liberia and Philippines. They stepped up. That was not in their job description, but they stepped up. And today, as we build back intentionally, gradually, we are back now in 57 countries with almost 2,400 volunteers. And our strategic plan that was launched in 2021 said that we were going to reimagine service, advance equity, and deliver quality. 3 very clear objectives with lots and lots of hard work and system change that was required behind that to make sure that we were setting ourselves up both to challenge the status quo, to build on our strengths, to expand our impact, and to set the stage for the future. One of those ways that we are reimagining service is really expanding our investment in host country volunteerism. So the Peace Corps Act specifically gives us authority both to send Americans out to volunteer, as well as to promote volunteerism. Now, our budget is limited in terms of how much we can spend on that, but we have been utilizing that authority in every way we can to work with partners around the world, to work with governments around the world, not on volunteerism in the sense of showing up for an Earth Day, but volunteerism as a pathway for one of the largest generations of youth in history. Right now, we have the largest generation of youth in history. So countries around the world, countries where Peace Corps serves, are looking for ways to engage young people and to not only teach English, but to create links to opportunity, to create links to jobs. And that has been a key thing that we have done both through host country volunteerism and supporting those opportunities that volunteers have and people have right here in America, but also through partnerships with organizations like Core Africa. Core Africa was founded by a Peace Corps volunteer, Liz Fanning, in Morocco. It was set up to provide opportunities based on Peace Corps principles, like the structure, the systems are all so very similar. But in Malawi, a college graduate can apply to be a Core Africa volunteer and go out and serve in a rural community and get similar training and learn about community development, learn about project design and implementation, and then become a leader in their own community. So we just signed an MOU with Core Africa so that our volunteers can serve side by side with volunteers in those countries. They just got funding to expand to a number of different countries around Africa. We're very excited, lots of enthusiasm about how we open up those kinds of systems and connections. Just a few days ago, and it hasn't been publicly released yet, we unveiled to our own team our new strategy for a resilient global future. We are very excited about the opportunity to engage in climate action, climate literacy with people who are on the front lines and who are really feeling the impacts, particularly around communities that are dependent on subsistence agriculture, who, if there are changes in weather patterns, might miss their one opportunity to grow food and create enough income to feed their families throughout the year. And I will say that during my time in Malawi, there was such a significant drought that 60% of the population required food assistance. 60%. This is a country that relies on subsistence agriculture. 85% of the population relies on subsistence agriculture. So these are very, very real impacts of climate disasters, of changing weather patterns. And Peace Corps is very excited to be really building on our work in the agriculture and environment space and looking at how we can integrate climate into everything from education. You can teach English with climate words and climate literacy as part of that, or youth and development. We recently launched a Blue Pacific Youth Initiative, and I'm very, very excited about this because what it does is tap into existing networks of youth programs in countries in the Pacific. And our volunteers there are joining these young people as stewards of the beautiful, vast oceans that we share. And the volunteers are engaging in promoting climate literacy, work on climate assessments, supporting community adaptation projects, and all of it really in the spirit of building, again, that opportunity for young people in those communities to lead. Our teams in Tonga just got together with this youth initiative, brought together local leaders, folks from the embassy, really a huge effort, planted 20,000 mangroves as part of the government's overall plan to plant 100,000. So we're very, very excited to see how we can think in our reimagined way about doing global good better, to say, how do we think about a volunteer, not just as one volunteer in one community for 2 years? How do we think about them as part of an ecosystem? How do we think about all of the volunteers who are out there, who are still connected with their communities? How do we think about that and broaden our lens? One of the other ways that we're doing that is embracing technology. We've all been doing that in new and different ways. And it was really a lifeline for all of us throughout the pandemic. As much as we love to hate Zoom, it does open up just this world of possibility. And I went to Indonesia. And when I was there, the government was saying, we'd like a volunteer for every one of our schools. Can you make that happen? It's like, well, I can't make that happen. And they said, okay. They had already been thinking forward, and it was the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and they wanted to get native English speakers into all of their classrooms in the madrasas. They put the digital technology into each and every one of those classrooms. They created a video to advertise it, and our volunteers are now hosting a monthly English club with 450 classrooms around the country at once. Not driven by Peace Corps, driven internally by Indonesia. Those possibilities are there. We're also embracing that technology here at home. During the pandemic, we got a request from the government of Botswana, and they said, can you help us with social media messaging and outreach so that people are getting the right information about COVID and ways to keep them safe? We said, well, we don't really have that. And in record time in government worlds, we stood up a virtual service program. It's currently only open to returned Peace Corps volunteers for a variety of reasons I won't get into here, but we're hoping to open it up more broadly. But since then, we've had 700 returned Peace Corps volunteers who previously served in every single decade of Peace Corps service. So people from the 60s and 70s engaging virtually, donating 5 to 15 hours of their time and expertise on very, very targeted assignments. And we've just had this overwhelmingly positive feedback, both from the volunteers as well as from communities who are in areas that Peace Corps couldn't reach previously. So although we would love to be able to put people in person to achieve the kind of person-to-person exchange that we want to be able to do, we cannot put a volunteer in the Medellin region of Colombia. We have safety and security concerns. When war broke out in Ukraine, we are still able, during a time of active war, to have volunteers engaging with communities and working with teachers on trauma-informed teaching practices. It's so incredibly powerful what's possible right now if we open ourselves up to thinking differently. So this is that moment. This is that moment as you all come together where I challenge you to challenge yourselves, to think differently, to open up what's possible, not just by doing things differently, but by engaging differently, engaging with each other differently, figuring out how we can leverage this joint impact. We just had a town hall with Peace Corps, our Peace Corps team around the world yesterday, and we rolled out a new HIV strategy as well. And I was really reflecting on when the HIV pandemic first broke out, and we were really just, there was a lot of chaos. You know, how do we contain this? What is it? What are we going to do? How are we going to move forward? And you look back just a couple of decades later, and this horrible global pandemic has taken a lot of lives. But through the combined action of academics, of governments, of nonprofits, of the private sector, there are countries like Malawi, one of the poorest countries in the world, that have achieved epidemic control. Like, that was unfathomable. Did I say that correctly? Unfathomable. Just a couple of decades ago. So I hope during this conference, you have the opportunity to dream big, to let that hope really come to life in this context of war, aggression, atrocities, climate disaster, like all of the things that we wake up and contend with on the news every single day, that you continue to bring that hope, that optimism, that joy, that creative thinking, all that brings that passion to life, to keep going, and to know that your individual action may make incremental change, but our collective action really does give us the opportunity to change the trajectory of where things will go in this new era. Thank you so much.
Hey everybody, my name is Erin Doak. I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer. I served in Albania from 2013 to 2016. So Peace Corps, as Carol mentioned, is normally 2 years. I extended with a project called GLOW, which stands for Girls Leading Our World. And I'll let my fellow panelists here introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their service.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Novak. I'm also our MINN president, or sorry, MINN treasurer. Oh my gosh, sorry, Kelly. Kelly is the MINN president. I totally misspoke. Sorry. Aspirational. I did my full Peace Corps service in Tanzania from 2015 to 2017, but I also had a very unique journey to Peace Corps in that I was initially placed in Liberia and started my service in 2014, but was evacuated due to the Ebola pandemic. So,
good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Wilsey, Dave Wilsey, and I'm the director of the Masters of Development Practice program here at the Humphrey School. I was a Peace Corps volunteer from 2002 to 2003 in Ecuador, in Southeast Ecuador, and I worked on small business development and organic agriculture.
Carol, did you want to say anything about your service?
There we go. Yeah, thanks. The only thing I wanted to really add about my service, I served with my husband, and that's an option for everyone. And it was 4 years after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. So just a very, again, unique time in history. And Romania is now a member of the EU. Peace Corps is not there anymore. That is not always the trajectory of all of the countries that we work with, but I think that really has impacted the way I think about where we are sort of right now and what this moment is.
Thank you for mentioning that. And just like hopefully that's on now. Do you want to test that one? Okay.
Sure. That's right.
Yeah. And there's a tech guy who's been really helpful. He's probably going to fix this. Yep, they're on it.
The IT guys always come and do something really easy that make the rest of us feel bad about ourselves.
Right? And then get to be like, woo, you did it.
Even better.
thank you.
So speaking of, yes, you can serve with your husband, which I think is very cool. And I think Peace Corps has now made it you can serve with your partner.
Yes.
Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. I think is pretty progressive. And also, I met my husband during my Peace Corps service. So he's a host country national. He's Albanian. And now we have a little, half American, half Albanian baby. So
Nice.
yeah, thank you. So I'm just going to jump into the questions. And the way I think we can do this, if you all agree, is that whoever has the, largest opinion about the question can jump in, but I will jump around to everybody to see if they have anything else they want to add. Does that work? Okay. So how do we in international development elevate locally led education, research, and cultural knowledge in a space that predominantly assumes expertise from outside the country? We jumped in with a hot one.
Oh, I was going to say, so I think first off, that we should be going into countries and communities, not assuming that Western practices are the right way, quote unquote, and really going in with an understanding of what is the knowledge that is passed down through the generations, right? How do communities learn kind of through education or, agriculture, and just kind of reflecting on what is that kind of cultural knowledge and how is it passed down, and just elevating that.
Dave, you have any thoughts on that?
I'll add only that I agree with that. And I think the work together and really pushing the genesis of project conception and development and program development to that kind of the collaborative space. So like building into the project design or building into the design of the relationship, the opportunity to be together doing the things that Sarah just described before the concept of a project takes form and takes root is a really essential part of kind of that shared learning and shared conception of what the work could be. And then really that collaborative work together is how all of those things that you asked about starts to take place.
Great. Carol?
Yeah, I'll just say there's a very strong ethos within Peace Corps that every volunteer around the world learns participatory analysis for community action. And I think that value system that's embedded within that is what binds us together so much as a community, and, you know, brings that ethos to life. But I'd like to tell you a story, because even with that, you know, in place, we had a volunteer who was working on distributing sweet potato vines, because they're more nutritious than the traditional maize. And, you know, some of it took off and some of it didn't. And she walked around the village with her counterpart and learned that just the week before, they had someone else coming and telling them to plant cassava. And someone else who came and said, you know, plant something else, and left them, you know, with some materials and some training. And very few of them implemented any of it. Why? Because they had no social safety net. They knew how to grow corn. They knew under which conditions they would fail, but they at least knew, right? So to take that leap of faith and try something new meant they were putting everything at risk in a place where they had no safety net, right? So it took walking around the village, talking to people, understanding why they didn't do it or why they did it, to really get at the root of how you shift the thinking to make it accessible. You know, do you give people some crop insurance to, you know, and maybe not in that fancy, you know, of a term, but some other way to catch them if they fall the first time around or the second time around.
Great, thank you. Okay, so for the next question, could you please discuss in your personal experience what can help a person be successful in Peace Corps service or living/working abroad, and any advice for someone thinking of working overseas?
I'll take that one.
Go ahead, Dave.
Go for it, Dave.
I think about this one a lot, and in large part because I think when I started Peace Corps, I was coming out of my master's, and I was feeling pretty good about myself and what I knew, and thought I had a lot to offer, right? So it's hard for me to say that actually out loud, especially given the fact that I teach against that right now here at the school. But yeah, that's who I was, right? So I learned the hard way that what I had to offer wasn't always, and maybe wasn't often, what anyone was that interested in hearing. And that I could have, I mean, I'm glad I did what I did, and I'm appreciative of my master's training, but I think one thing I didn't spend as much time as I could have was understanding my motivations for being in the Peace Corps, and understanding what the world was like in Ecuador in my particular case, and how people lived and created lives and livelihoods in that place. And the combination of not really investing enough in those two things meant that when I showed up, I wasn't ready to kind of see, and I wasn't ready to receive the signals that were coming from the folks that I interacted with. And that slowed me down a lot. It slowed down the relationships, and it slowed down the work that we ultimately got to, but through a much harder path than it would otherwise been. And so my advice then is that, right, is not only prepare yourself to build skills and techniques and knowledge, but also prepare yourself to kind of come in a kind of an open and learning posture, and see that as the first step when you arrive, and then know that and trust that the work, if and when it emerges, will emerge from the relationships that you build and your understanding of the world that you're working in, and not your expertise necessarily.
I think of this question, and I think a lot about my own kind of mental well-being when I was a Peace Corps volunteer. So I think the biggest advice I got before I left was, you don't become a different person when you land in the new country. So what brought you joy in the United States will likely also bring you joy in wherever you are. So that means if you like to read, if you have any sort of hobbies, like whatever brings you joy, you should bring that with you if you can, if it's possible, whether that be music, you know, books, movies, anything like that. And I think that really helped me because oftentimes in Peace Corps service, and also I think when working abroad, it can get lonely. You can spend a lot of time by
Yes.
yourself.
A lot of
Um,
lonely nights in Peace Corps.
Yeah, for sure. And so having those things, right, that bring you joy, can be really helpful. But then kind of along with that is making friends, making local friends, right? I actually just went back to my Peace Corps site a few weeks ago after about 7 years away, and those friendships are still as strong as when I went there. Mostly because I maintained them after I left, but also it just kind of reminded me like how many friends I made who were in my community. So that was very helpful.
Well, and this question reminded me of, and Carol, you probably know the chart I'm about to talk about, but there is a chart in Peace Corps. I don't know if it still gets passed around, but it's about the ups and downs of the emotions throughout your service. And they've, right through a lot of interviews and surveying, they've kind of figured out this pattern that most volunteers go through emotionally and mental health wise during their 2 years of service. And it's really interesting. I don't have it memorized, but I looked at it a couple times during my service because there's times where you're really going to feel like, oh my gosh, what have I done? Is this going to work out? I'm terrified. But then there's times where you're going to be like, this is the most amazing thing I've ever done in my life. This has changed me. This is changing the world around me. I'm making a difference. Like, you'll really ride all the waves. Does that sound right to you guys? Is that true for you?
Absolutely, yes.
That can be in the same day.
So
And
true.
often is, right? Hour to hour sometimes. Does Peace Corps still use that chart? You know the one I'm talking about. Yeah.
We do. Look, I think Peace Corps is for, people who really are open, right, to what is a journey. It's not an adventure. It's not, it's not a lot of things, but it is a journey. And that means it has those highs and lows. So when we are looking for candidates, and I think about the candidates who really thrived in Peace Corps, it was those people who could lift up and say, all right, this was a bad day, but I'm okay. I failed. And I'm going to get back up and try something new tomorrow. And when I talk to employers who very much want to hire returned Peace Corps volunteers, they tell me it's because of some of those skills, right? The creative problem solving, all of the grit, the resilience, the ability to dust yourself off. But the people who actually do want to get in the ring, right? And get dirty and, engage and challenge themselves. And that ultimately is, through that engagement across cultures by moving that far outside of your comfort zone, that's where the growth happens, both for yourself and for those with whom you work, who are welcoming you, a stranger, right, into their homes, into their community in partnership, which is really powerful.
Great. Well, and I always just think about too how hard it is to do the simplest task too once you're a Peace Corps volunteer, right? And I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this, but even just going to buy a loaf of bread all of a sudden is incredibly challenging. And everything like that is a challenge, right?
Laundry.
Can I tell you a bread story?
Of course, we're here for it.
Sorry, this is, you got us in the space of like returned Peace Corps volunteers telling stories. And when you get us there, we won't stop. But this one really struck me. So we opened our first post ever in Vietnam this last year. And it was so incredibly powerful and emotional to be there with people who grew up, in the Vietnam War era, to see us, the symbolism of Peace Corps being present in Vietnam. And it took a very long time to make this happen. So tremendous gratitude to all of the people who really worked hard. One of our volunteers went out and they were living at a school, and the school had a gate and there was a guard, and he wanted to go and buy bread. And he went to the gate, and the guard, he thought the guard told him, no, you can't leave the school premises to buy bread. And he was very upset. And he called his program manager, who the next day called the school principal, who talked to the guard. And the guard explained that what he was trying to tell the volunteer was that you shouldn't buy bread at the end of the day because it's stale and he should wait until the morning. And I just love that story because it conveys like all of the beauty and frustration and the way people are welcomed and how things are misinterpreted like all at once.
100%. Yeah, I feel like everybody has a story like that too, right? Where there's some kind of terrible communication breakdown and it feels like the end of the world in the moment, but you learn afterwards it was you didn't understand. So, all right, well, let's move on to the next question. So the Peace Corps is is vocal about the importance of sustainability. Yet many times after 2 years of service, local community leaders are left with the responsibility of carrying the projects on. How can the Peace Corps and other INGOs successfully involve local governments and community-led NGOs to ensure sustainability?
So as I listen to that question, I think it's not a bad thing that local community members are carrying on the projects because that means they were engaged in it and care about it enough to carry it on. And that means that they were, they were brought in along the way. And, with Peace Corps, any small project, especially if it requires outside grant funding, requires a 25% community contribution for this very purpose. And we do get some small project assistance grant funds from USAID. And they did a review of those projects and found tremendous sustainability for that reason. So I think that, even in talking with some communities here in Minnesota earlier this morning, there is this sense of responsibility when it is your community and engagement and care. Yes, local governments and other partners, ideally are able to step in where there's not sufficient funding or, where there is some other aspect that requires that outside assistance. But again, we saw during COVID where volunteers had to pick up and leave like this, like sometimes with no goodbye, sometimes they were at training in the Capitol, didn't get to go back to their sites, and tremendous work still happened afterwards. Does that mean that the volunteers weren't needed? Look, I think what volunteers bring is a different perspective. They bring passion, they bring hope, sometimes they bring resources, but it's that spark, right, that you get even now if you're meeting someone who really grabs your attention and, can mentor you or pull you in a different direction. So, again, some people said, well, if they continued it, then people don't need the Peace Corps. Peace Corps has 3 goals. One is about development, where we are asked, where we are invited to go, that we provide skilled people to be able to meet those needs. The other 2 goals are cross-cultural. It's about bringing America to the world, and it's about bringing the culture of that world, of that country back to America. That will always be needed, and it will always be needed, especially right now. That sentence doesn't make sense, but it is needed especially right now when we are reconnecting after COVID.
So on that topic, and maybe you guys have feelings about this, but with that 3rd goal of bringing a country back, there's all these opportunities Peace Corps has to sort of encourage volunteers to do that, right? There's like blog competitions and things like that. I've heard volunteers call that sort of performative volunteering. Do you have any thoughts on that? Anybody on the panel? Like I had a volunteer friend who called it that, and she won a blogging competition, but I think it can be complicated feelings around it.
Can I clarify your question? Are you saying that the volunteers themselves are feeling that it's performative volunteering?
They can. I've heard that, I guess, at least. I've heard that.
I'll say that voices are important. Who's speaking, who's representing is incredibly important. And, again, coming out of the pandemic, Peace Corps put out an ethical storytelling toolkit. It's available online. And we have all of our recruiters and others, we encourage Return to Peace Corps volunteers to go and engage with it. And it's a toolkit that can be used to train others as well. And is recognizing whose voice are you representing and what does that mean? We did a storytelling competition, and had folks speak at the Kennedy Center last year, most of the winners were local staff who were able to represent their experience with the Peace Corps. And the one that we just rolled out, the net has been cast even wider, so that it includes, community members, counterparts, and others who can also, submit their stories. So those things are shifting and changing,
That is
which I think
great.
is terrific. Yeah.
Great. Did you want to say something,
I
Dave?
do want to add to that. Yeah, I think for me, I guess I don't really feel there's a performative aspect to it unless it is something that is kind of expected that you do, right? But beyond those things that might feel like formal, large scale, large format outreach for the third goal, I think that masks a little bit of what happens on the everyday experiential level, right? Like every day, not literally every day, but like literally every day I have the opportunity to share something directly or indirectly about my Peace Corps experience with people that I know or encounter. And the sum total of that over time, to me, feels authentic and far more impactful than one particular. It may not actually be, but it feels like it's more impactful than one particular kind of targeted storytelling event or something more formally done to help people to get that story out. But I think maybe it depends on where you feel like you need the push, right? If you feel comfortable doing it in this domain, maybe that's the space you do it. If you feel like that's something you don't want to do, then those opportunities to tell stories or share blogs or things of that nature give you a forum for something that can be difficult, because I think that's one thing we were chatting about in the back, is that often people, one of these shared experiences I think we all have is that when you come back, you only get so much time to tell your story to any one person. And that's usually about 30 seconds. And then you're done. So
If that.
yeah, if that. So, you learn kind of fast that you have to drip it as opposed to hose it on people.
I was going to say, when I was thinking about performative, I was thinking a lot about like, there's a difference, and going back to what you said, Carol, but like sharing your story maybe one-on-one versus being an influencer on social media, right? And I think it goes back to Carol, like saying whose story are you telling and who's the person doing the speaking, and just being really thinking through that, right? Like if you're sharing someone else's story, how are you sharing it? To whom are you sharing it? Make sure that you're thinking through those questions for yourself. But I do think that those one-on-one interactions, like you said, Dave, like are so much more meaningful as a returned Peace Corps volunteer than the blog, who I wasn't sure, like, I did keep a blog and I was never sure if people even read it or like if my family, what they took from it or anything like. I wasn't sure if it even worked as a.
Yeah, I'll just add one other thing, because we think about this in the recruiting space. How do we get the message out there that we're invited formally by governments? We are invited into communities. We only go where we're invited. We create our project frameworks with broad engagement from civil society, from government, from communities, and with volunteers involved. Those are things that are embedded, right, in the way that we do things. But when we're out talking to people about joining the Peace Corps, it's very hard to get the voices of those who have asked for us to be there to say why it's important to them. And I have the privilege of sitting in spaces, where the Minister of Education is telling me that English education is so important because it's the language of the internet. It's the language of knowledge of the future. It's the language of tourism, of business. And if they want to provide opportunity for young people, they need to know English, and they can learn it, in lots of different ways, but to engage with someone, who is a native speaker is something completely different. And some countries have said, we will only take certified teachers. Other countries have said, we will take 2,000, I'm not kidding, 2,000 of your generalists, because we want that engagement, we want the spark, we want the creativity, we want the passion. So what we're trying to do is really just take the lead from the country in terms of what it is that they want and what they're asking for. We have been experimenting a little bit. So we right now have 14 of our locally employed staff around the United States recruiting for us so that they can tell their story about why they're involved with Peace Corps. Why do they love it? Why is it important for their country? Why do they, care enough to be here and speaking in different audiences? And it's been incredibly powerful. I don't know that we'll be able to continue to do it for a variety of reasons, but we're going to try to figure out how to replicate in whatever way we can, whether it's on Zoom or periodically inviting people over to be that voice. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that. And the next one. So global and local challenges are converging and accelerating. In this context and drawing on your experiences as a volunteer or professional, what should the Peace Corps be considering and training to better achieve its mission?
Well, I was really excited to hear you speak earlier about climate, change and how that's going to be integrated in, because I think that that is something that actually impacts the day-to-day of so many volunteers, especially if you, where I served in Tanzania, the good majority of the country was in a drought basically the entire time I lived there, which meant that they had extremely little water, like just enough to drink water, maybe take a bath like once a month or something. But, like that matters, right? And getting that rainfall is very important for crops, but also just for livelihood. So how do you have those conversations with communities and making sure that, they have the right resources and that they can talk about it and also talk about it with the right, in the language that they use on how to share out climate change. So.
And I think having predominantly locals involved with running Peace Corps is so important, right? Because I think about how complex each country is, how complex their challenges are. I mean, just my service in the Balkans, thinking about there was so much I didn't know about the conflicts within the Balkans that you learn in Peace Corps. Just even the differences in the languages, and I'm sure that's true in y'all's countries too, that there's these different dialects that dramatically change, and really they have their own different cultures, even though they're technically considered their own language or the same language. And so I think a lot of people may not know about how involved local staff is within Peace Corps, but when you get there, you do find out. And we have counterparts, and I don't know if folks know what that is, but counterparts are host country nationals that we serve alongside, and they are usually a part of the request process. I don't even know, or if I can remember all the details about how a counterpart gets assigned to somebody, but they're really important in our work for lots of reasons. But Dave, did you want to say something about the question? If you want me to repeat it, I totally can. Absolutely. So yeah, well, and we were just talking about global and local challenges, and Sarah talked about the drought and what should Peace Corps be considering to train better to achieve its mission.
Yeah, and I think my response may be a little dated, right? I'm 20 something years out of service, but I'll tell you that my training was segregated by topic area, right? So I trained with natural resource folks, and other people trained with animal production folks, and other people trained with public health, all within my cohort of volunteers. I think one of the things that occurred during that, I think probably more a function of logistics, is that we ended up training with one of those other groups all the time, just because we were sharing a bus. And then we'd sometimes go to different things, but sometimes we'd go to the same. And I think as we come to recognize the interconnected systems that we're dealing with and challenges that we're dealing with, it strikes me that more of that cross-training, which is not initially how Peace Corps was set up, right, which was training specialists or early specialists, but more of that cross-training gives people the ability to see more of an issue and to see more solutions within that workspace. And so, to the extent that that's happening more in the training of Peace Corps volunteers today, I think that would be advantageous. And I think I was really encouraged by what you said in your remarks about new ways that Peace Corps service is being created, or opportunities are being created. And I think diversifying the way that we do the work as well as the work that we do are two really important strategies to the kind of moment that we're in.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on to these next questions. So this one, I think everybody will have interesting thoughts on. Is there potential harm that could be done by Peace Corps or NGOs entering certain communities?
I could take that one first. I think there's always harm that can be done. And I think it's every organization's profound responsibility to be very intentional about how they do the work, how they recruit the people who are coming in to do the work, how they train so that people are, going into communities as a guest, are going in with the knowledge, skills, attitudes, tools that we've done the work to set that up, not just for success, but also to be very, very careful and intentional, about potential harm. So that is a profound responsibility of each and every one of us who are, whether it's working outside of our own community here in the US and entering another community, even within our own cultural context. I think it's worth doing. I think it's important that we do it so that we all know how to work across difference and, to work together and have that sort of self-other bridge, those skills. And I will say that Peace Corps has tried to do that with incredible intentionality. And there's always more, right? There's always more we can do in ways we can learn, how we bring community into the classroom, how we're accountable back to the community, all very, very important.
Dave, Sarah?
Well, I was going to say, I agree with what you said, Carol, and I think we need to be, I guess, welcoming to make mistakes, but also like to go in to communities or into work with an openness to like acknowledge harm that you maybe have done. And that could be through mistakes you personally have made, or even, maybe you just didn't simply know something, and that's okay. But harm was done, and acknowledging it and asking how to do it better, how to right harm. I think we can think of harm as very severe, but we can also should be thinking about it in, I think, maybe like more everyday interactions. Maybe
Say more about that.
maybe, it could be something as simple as you didn't take off your shoes when you entered the house. And if that's
Cultural
part
stuff,
of,
yeah.
cultural, just kind of understanding the cultural nuances, the cultural knowledge. So you could be imposing harm, right? That could be, it could be honestly very harmful if you aren't following the appropriate cultural practices of some communities. So just recognizing that, knowing it if you can, and making an effort to do better if you do make a mistake.
Go for it.
I love that. The everyday harm, I think, is something that I was thinking. I guess I believe that as a Peace Corps volunteer or any sort of practitioner, you will do harm, right? I think that's kind of the starting point. And I know we don't want to, and I know we want to work to minimize it or eliminate it, but it's going to happen. And I think what's special about the Peace Corps and the Peace Corps experience, it relates a lot to what Sarah said, and that's that it affords us the time to repair harm that we might do, right? So like you are going to do things that inflict harm, or however you want to characterize it, but you're going to be there long enough to learn from that and to change the way you think about the situation or change the way that you behave. And like any relationship that we have with another human, right, we're going to hurt each other at some point. But if you stay in that relationship, you can typically work through it and build a stronger and better bond than you would otherwise have. And I think the harm that comes from coming and going quickly is far more profound than the harms that might come from, the long-term investment that we make for 2 and sometimes more years as Peace Corps volunteers. And I think that that's something that might get overlooked when we think about the time scale of what a Peace Corps volunteer experience looks like, but it's a really important feature of it.
Well, and that's all relative too, right? I mean, considering what is long-term and what is short-term, right? Because now there's volunteerism, which can be incredibly fast. It can be a week. And Peace Corps service is a different length for everybody for a plethora of reasons. But those were all really good points about reducing harm. And it did remind me of IRB. Does IRB ring a bell for?
Institutional Review Board, like research?
No,
Oh.
for Peace Corps, for
Oh.
PST specifically.
There's so many
Do you
acronyms
remember-
in Peace
there's
Corps.
so many, especially in the US
It's been
government.
displaced by the university definition.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, for me, it sticks in my mind because it still is very relevant to me this day, but we used it in my country. It was intentional relationship building. And it was a very big focus in our pre-service training. And I'm sure it is in every country, right? Yeah, and I'm sure, do you guys remember what yours was called? Or was it just called relationship building? Maybe it wasn't a focus.
I don't remember.
Yeah, it's a focus everywhere, but I don't know that it became its own acronym.
Well, in Peace Corps Albania, it is. And maybe that's because we used to call going to coffee for hours at a time, IRB, right? So it was right, yeah. But that definitely stuck with me because even today, I feel like that's such an important lesson that I took away from my service, is that if you can build a foundation in your relationships, a lot of challenges can be overcome, right? It's so important in any job you have to be intentional about what kind of relationships you're building. Love IRB. That's why it sticks in my mind. So this is another, I think, important one for us to reflect on, but could you reflect on things you could have done differently to better serve the communities you were in? And we kind of touched on that on the potential harms, but looking back on your service, especially somebody like Dave or Carol, and you have this kind of hindsight and all these experiences after your service, are there things that you wish you had done differently?
So many, always. That's why it's called hindsight.
Exactly.
2020. I don't even know where to start because there's this, just profound realization that, and Dave, I think you were talking about this a little bit of, what you thought you were coming with and, and what you experienced. And I was in post-communist Romania as a small business development volunteer. And there's an entire society shifting from a communist state-run economy to small businesses, like private enterprise starting. It's the magnitude of it is huge. And we were, just growing up during the Cold War, you didn't know sort of what was happening behind the curtain. And, really understanding what the communist system did to people's psyche and their level of trust, right? So my Peace Corps experience was very different than the experience of my volunteers in Malawi, who were, welcomed in a different way and maybe had more physical hardships. And, we were there, at a time when people walked outside to have a conversation in the street because they didn't know who was listening inside. And I wish I had the, different skills to be able to navigate that part of it, because it was a very big disruptor of our work, but you didn't always know why.
Yeah, and I can really relate to that with Peace Corps Albania too, right? So communism didn't collapse until 1990 when the dictator passed away. And then there was civil unrest through much of the late 90s. And then, of course, the Kosovo-Serbia war. So it was very similar. I mean, definitely not nearly as recently as yours, but, everybody I served with remembered the dictator fondly. They remember communism fondly. And it was, I don't know if this was true where you served, but we were usually suspected of being spies, because it was very strange that you would be speaking Albanian, but you're not Albanian, but you're American. What are you doing here? You work for the government. I'm sure it was similar.
There were some questions, certainly that people had. And then there were sort of the little ladies out in the villages. I mean, I had one woman who looked up in the air when she found out I was American and said, America, we waited 40 years for the Americans to come. Right. And then you talked about there being nostalgia. There was nostalgia 4 years after the fall of communism for a time when everybody had a job. But then there were also some very severe, severe squashing of rights and not having access to things. So again, you can't know all of that going in, and that's part of the journey and part of the process. I guess I've had a lot of time to reflect and think about the different experiences of working in different parts of the world and what that means. And the gratitude I feel right now for having been able to experience that is just incredible.
Yeah, ditto. I feel the same way. I share the sentiment. It feels very fortunate. Dave, were you going to add something about reflecting on your experience?
I could. I'll keep it brief, but I think something that kind of is natural now that wasn't then is this idea of kind of understanding your privilege and who you are and how you show up in a space. And I'll be honest, I didn't have, that wasn't, I guess, part of the the zeitgeist of the late 90s, and therefore when I showed up, I didn't really understand the influence of how everything about me and everything I had and everything I did and the way I kind of stepped into spaces and expected things to happen was really a reflection of some of those things. And I'm glad that conversation happens now. And I think volunteers are probably better off for it and kind of move into that space in a much different way than we did 20, 25 years ago.
Perfect. Sarah, I wanted to give you the opportunity. Okay. You don't have to, but
Yeah, I don't know that I have much to add.
well, and one thing I was thinking about Albania too is when you mentioned that about Romania, is some countries really are excited to have Americans there and some are not. I know that in Peace Corps Albania, it was a similar sentiment to Kosovo. They speak the same language, and it's the concept that they feel like America saved them when Serbia was bombing them and Clinton came in and said, stop the bombs. So, there's boulevards named after most American presidents. There's Bill Clinton statues. There's sort of an adoration for Bill Clinton and Americans in general. And so I didn't know that, but that was my own ignorance. And that was definitely a learning process. And I know there was volunteers who served in places where maybe they wouldn't share immediately that they were American, kind of just reading the room, depending on what was going on. I'll move on to the next question though. What do you say to people who say that Peace Corps is contributing to white saviorism, or who say it's a form of neocolonialism? I'll leave that one for anyone. It's a hot one.
This is a hot one, and I'm glad you raised it, because I do have people ask me that question a lot, and I have had currently serving volunteers say, I almost didn't join because I was worried about that. But now that I'm here and I see what it's about, I'm glad I did. And I think it's easy for us to throw around terms. And I think it's very, very important, as you said, Dave, for people to know, who they are, what their identity is, what their privilege is, all of the different things that they're coming in with. When I think about saviorism, it's an attitude, right? It's an attitude that you can be a savior. You can have a savioristic attitude going to the church down the street. You can think yourself exceptional, going in anywhere that you are, quote, trying to help. So does that mean that you don't engage, that you stick to yourself? Or does it mean that you engage, and you engage recognizing that there is wisdom and knowledge, and we have a set of values that we put out as Peace Corps, that there is wisdom and knowledge in every community, in every household, in every person, and that potential is there, right? So that attitude is important to check, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't engage, and that you shouldn't engage across difference, and you shouldn't try to do good better, right? And that's what we're called to do. And the colonialism, like the structures that have influenced where we are in the world right now, are very important to unpack. And that speaks to, who is making decisions about where money goes, right? What are the power structures? What are the power imbalances? What are the things that support all of those in big ways and small? I mean, we've even looked at Peace Corps, some of the, murals that volunteers, paint, and how are they set up? Which country is, in the middle right there? I mean, it's all of those different pieces.
Sure.
And then how are you accountable back to the community? So anyone who wants to have that conversation, you are the people we want in Peace Corps, because you're the people who want to ask those questions and examine those issues and show up with the kind of intentionality that we really need.
Well, that's great to hear. And I know Peace Corps has been working on being more diverse, right? And especially in their volunteers. I think that's a challenge. And I would just be curious to hear more about what Peace Corps is doing to address that, because I think, just thinking about white saviorism, it can be a very predominantly white field. So what's Peace Corps doing to get more diversity in their volunteers?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. And I'm particularly excited today because just before this, I was in Brooklyn Park with the mayor, and we gathered a group of diaspora leaders. And I met a volunteer just across the board. Our country directors are saying, wow, we've got so many people from the diaspora who are serving. And, I met someone who grew up in Sierra Leone, became a US citizen, served in Ghana. And all of that engagement is just priceless. And we really want to make sure that we are reflecting the full diversity of America. We launched our Bold Invitation campaign, which you saw up top there. And with the way that advertising can be targeted and segmented now, we really worked very hard to make sure that we were reaching populations we didn't normally reach. And we've increased the pool of applicants such that 49% self-identify as BIPOC, which we're very excited about. We have seen across the board different, more people leaving during the clearance process. So we're trying to unpack what are those barriers to service. But in terms of volunteers in service right now, it's about 34% BIPOC, and those are just numbers, right? So I want to distinguish the numbers from the sense of belonging and inclusion that we are working very hard to make sure that our systems and structures, welcome everybody in, and also that we've got the support structures that respond to the unique needs of lots of different communities, which vary across the board. It is harder for some of our BIPOC volunteers to serve in some Eastern European countries. It is very hard for our LGBTQ plus volunteers to serve in certain countries in Africa where it's been criminalized. So, that's a very, very big part of the equation, is making sure that the unique needs are being met throughout service, and it's not just the number, bringing people in.
Perfect. Thank you. And I feel like Kelly's telling us we got to wrap it up.
Oh, I'm so sad, but thank you very, very much to every single one of you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You can come sit down over here.
Thank you guys so much for listening.
Yeah, you can just sit down for a second. So, wow, that was incredible. That went really fast. So a huge thank you to Carol for coming to visit us. It was amazing to hear her speak. So thank you again, Carol. We really appreciate it. This is actually the last time we're all going to be together in a room. So I'm just kind of doing some end of the day things, even though there's still one more session. But instead of having you all come back here and say thank you, you can just go home or, enjoy your weekend. So just a couple little last minute things. We do love evaluations. So if you could fill out the evaluation for the summit, we would greatly appreciate it. That is the QR code. I think we're emailing you one too. So, but that would be greatly appreciated for any feedback that you have for us. And like I began this morning, if you were with us, I hope you asked questions today, and maybe you didn't get all the answers, but you asked questions of yourself and others, and just began the dialogue of growth and being leaders that lead with integrity and empathy. And wow, Carol really brought that home as we kind of began today. So thank you for being a part of MINN. If you would like to be involved more, we actually have board applications open right now for the 2024 year, if that's something that you're interested in, or volunteering, or just being a part of this community and networking with all the wonderful people in the room, we would just encourage you to do that. So I hope you have a wonderful weekend and thank you for spending time with us. There was one request, if Carol has a minute, from a different, not panel, returned Peace Corps volunteer to ask if you could all be on the stage for one picture, everyone in the room that is a returned Peace Corps volunteer to have a picture with you. Is that okay? Yeah, I'll put it back to the return Peace Corps. Yes, sounds good. Thank you very, very, very much. Have a great weekend and the rest in the last session. All right, if you're a returned Peace Corps volunteer, you can come down.